You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
Hey guys, this is your host Josh Lewis, and in this episode, I have a conversation with fellow Josh Bandoch, about his new book with the provocative title, How to Get What You Want, Mastering the Art and Science of Persuasion. Josh is of the opinion, and I am inclined to agree, that our politics these days is bereft of actual persuasion. Not shouting at each other, not trying to denounce the other side, not trying to convince people they're wrong and you're right, but an actual good-faith effort at trying to connect with the feelings, the thoughts, and the hearts of others, and to persuade them to our point of view. Is that even possible in today's political climate? What would that kind of persuasion look like, and are there people today or in the past who have practiced this sort of persuasion that we could look to that might help us hone our own skills? We get into all that and so much more. I give you then my conversation with Josh Bandoch.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
I think it's just taken for granted these days that we lack in persuasion skills, at least in public policy and in political debates. But I don't know if that's true or not. In your view, are we uniquely bad at persuasion now? And if so, when were we, that being the United States, good at persuasion?
We face some headwinds now that make it harder to persuade. Does that make us uniquely bad? I guess we'll see. A couple of years ago, Pew did a survey, asked Americans essentially how they feel about American politics. A paltry 2% gave a positive answer, and 79% gave a negative answer. And they did this really cool word cloud. And one of the most popular responses was dumpster fire. And Americans know that something's not right. And I think a big thing that is just totally broken in American politics is that the toxic polarization that we suffer under makes it pretty much impossible to talk to people who don't think like you. And the trouble is that there's only one person who thinks like you, and that's you. And I don't even agree with everything that I did yesterday. So that's like the first problem. And I think that tied to that, there are two just common misconceptions of persuasion that predate all this toxic polarization that also are headwinds against persuasion. And there's a happy but ending here, which I'll get to, which is that no, it hasn't always been this bad. And the first is that we think that persuasion is about winning. And Josh, if I win against you, what does that make you?
Well, certainly not the winner.
That makes you a loser, right? That sucks.
Mm-hmm.
So that persuasion can't be about winning. And some people think that persuasion is about convincing someone to think like them. And the trouble with that is that the Latin root of the word convince actually means to vanquish or to conquer. And conquest is barbaric. Sadly, people think that conquest is the way that you persuade now. I was talking to a friend recently. He was talking about like how online now you're supposed to try and annihilate somebody. It's like, well, I don't know. Has someone ever persuaded you by annihilating you? And it hasn't always been this way. Actually, I think if you go back to our founding, America was literally founded on persuasion. If you look at the convention in 1787, the founders locked themselves up in a hall in Philadelphia for about 4 months, and they went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and out popped an amazing thing, the American Constitution. And then the Federalist Papers, they had to advocate for that thing, and certainly Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay didn't agree about everything. And they were full force advocating for the Constitution, which means two things. One, that they were able to talk, have a back and forth, and then eventually agree on things that, while not everyone got what they wanted, people were ultimately happy with, and it proved extremely durable.
So it's interesting you mentioned the founding, and I think you would be right that that's a window of, say, persuasion we could profit from. But I'm also thinking of two founding figures, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who rather infamously in George Washington's administration were each leaking information to members of the press that were favorable to their point of view to essentially badmouth the other side. The Hamiltonians were trying to destroy the Jeffersonians trying to do with that the Hamiltonians. And I don't necessarily know of any modern day equivalent I could point to of saying these two members of the Trump administration are actively trying to harm each other through the back doors. Now, I'm sure it happens, but to the degree it did then was flabbergasting. So these are individuals, say, who certainly showed the ability to be conniving and backstabbing and stuff like this. That being said, when you're talking about the founding period, grinding out the Declaration, certainly grinding out the Constitution, there were some noticeable differences between that day and this. I mean, mainly I don't want to lean on it too heavily, but you don't have social media, right? You don't have, well, did you hear what Thomas Jefferson said, or Hamilton really owned the other side today? You had rather these sort of closed-door meetings, and I know some have bemoaned the fact, even say in the United States Congress, the degree to which it's largely performative. And so I guess I'm wondering, again, I try to be a little careful here because I think we have a tendency to blame too much on technologies, where that's kind of why I started with human nature is human nature, and you still have your Jeffersons and Hamiltons, brilliant, wonderful men who are still backstabbing. But it strikes me that we don't really facilitate the possibilities of persuasion, at least say like in the halls of Congress and our legislative functions. Like, is this something that, I don't mean to jump too far ahead in the conversation, but is this something that is necessarily both a relearning the tools of persuasion, but also recognize the institutional need for reform to make it even possible? Like, I don't even know how this would work in our modern day Congress.
Yes, is the short answer. There are, I think, two parts here. One is just understanding cognitively how persuasion works. And that's been true, well, for as long as human beings have existed. We haven't, we don't evolve overnight. And the second part of it is that what is unique about today? And I think there are a couple of things there. Some are enhancements of our wiring that make it hard to persuade, and some are maybe a breakdown of institutions. There are a couple aspects of our wiring that I'll just go over briefly that have always made it hard for us to persuade. We are wired to think about ourselves. It feels good. In fact, talking about ourselves generates the same feelings in our brain as sex and money. So we adopt what I call a me first mindset. The problem with that is that when I make it all about me, it's not persuasive to you. So you have to put them first, but we're not wired to do that. The second, and all my intellectual friends totally hate this one, and I used to. We are wired to feel first, then reason. And yet, especially intellectual types think that persuasion starts, continues, and concludes only with logic. But that's not true. Persuasion starts with feelings. The third is that, and I think this is one we'll press on in particular with social media, is that we are wired to be negative. We have something called negativity bias. It's adaptive. It's an evolved mechanism that helps us, that protects us from threats. The problem is that negativity is not persuasive. We can talk about what is. And then one good part about our wiring that actually is really helpful is that we're wired for story in the name of a great book. So stories are one way to unlock persuasion that actually is in tune with our wiring. I think some things that are unique about today, the first is that social media is literally wired from the computer programming standpoint. It is literally wired to play on some of these things, particularly the negativity bias. And it just draws out all the negative information. I mean, clickbait is a thing, and TikTok in particular, I think, thrives on this. So they are just wired to keep your attention, and they're really good at it because more time on screen is time that they're making money from advertising. And you talked about platforming, and I completely agree. Yuval Levin has talked a lot about this, so he's one good person to look to for more on this. That Congress, the presidency, et cetera, used to be about institutions. And now they're much more about the individuals who see those institutions simply as platforms to build their personal brand. And I think that that's deeply toxic for our politics.
I congratulate you on mentioning Yuval Levin. There's a couple of buzzwords here, and Yuval Levin is one of them, certainly in Saving Elephants. I've had the good pleasure of having him on several times, and he is a uniquely humble man in spite of his immense intellectual genius and I think just capacity for distilling our moment to just a few sentences. So yeah. So there's three things there: putting others first, the idea that our feelings precede our reason, and then the fact we're wired to be negative. And any of all three of those, hopefully, we'll pull on a little bit more in the conversation. I know in listening to some conversations you've had before, a lot of time gets spent on that middle one. Our feelings precede our facts. Understandably so. And this is something that, I confessed I'm a Burkean conservative, so I don't find this nearly as startling on the right as maybe some others. I know many spokespeople on the right have made it a cottage industry to bemoan the left as being squishy, feely, uh, individuals who just emote but don't actually accomplish much of anything. And I will, in all fairness, I think there was legit critique. I'm not just going to say of the left. I think there was a legit criticism of those who are blinded to, say, externalities that are measurable and instead lead only with feelings. It's not that feelings triumph over facts or that feelings are superior. And I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but my understanding it is that our wiring is such that our feelings precede our capacity for rationalizing. And I know probably the closest thing to hand these days, of course, is the Ben Shapiro quote that facts don't care about your feelings, which is, I suppose, a true statement. If I stand outside in traffic, it doesn't matter how I feel about the thing. The fact of an automobile is going to be pretty, pretty damaging to my person. The inverse is also true, right? That feelings don't care about your facts. And so I want to open this, help me understand, because I'm throwing a lot of things out there. But when you say that, I think there's a certain personality type out there that sort of says, well, that's a problem. That's something to be corrected. Yeah. But why is it we're wired to proceed with feelings? And why is that all even pressed further? Why is that not necessarily a bad thing, something to be corrected?
In my former life, I was an academic. And that meant that I spent a decade learning that the only way to properly persuade people was to, sure, do all that research, logic, rigor, and then submit things to the peer review process. And I was a journal editor, and I also wrote things for peer review. And it's funny, you could submit a paper to a journal, and you could get 2 reviews, and one review would say that this was just the best paper on this topic ever, and the next review, same article, would say this is the worst. This is the worst article on this ever. And I had the good fortune of studying and teaching at a couple of good schools, and these are people super high IQ, really smart, and fancy degrees from fancy schools, teaching at fancy schools. And somehow they could disagree so vehemently on things. Like, it's just like, look at this, and just like radically different perspectives. I was like, wait a minute, something's off here. Because if persuasion were all about IQ, and if we're all about logic, then wouldn't the Academy have just reached consensus on everything? Because these are like the smartest people around, and they haven't. So what's going on? This book draws on a lot of neuroscience and a lot of psychology. And this is just what all the neuroscience says. All 8 billion human beings are wired to feel first, then reason. Sometimes it's feel, boom, reason. Sometimes it's feel, then reason. Sometimes it's feel, and we never get to reasoning. We've all been there. I have. And fun fact, people who sadly, like tragically, lose the ability to emote, their reasoning is actually impaired. So emotions actually enhance our reasoning. What all this means is that the logic first approach to persuasion that so many quote unquote smart people, friends of mine who work at think tanks, for example, I work at a think tank, that approach to persuasion is actually illogical. And that persuasion starts with feelings. This does not mean that IQ or logic, that these things are unimportant. It means that when you approach with an IQ only or an IQ first or a logic first approach, it is ineffective. You still need logic for things. I don't want my civil engineers feeling good about a design that's going to collapse. That would obviously be tragic. And this is just how our brains work. And people can say, well, shouldn't it be this way? Isn't it bad that we're wired to feel first? And I used to think that. And now I don't know, not at all. It's a beautiful thing because our intuitions, they are lightning fast, and they are pretty much always grounded in a reason or many reasons, and oftentimes a good reason. Like when you don't when you feel not so good about somebody, something's off. I don't know if I can trust them. I don't know if I believe that. There's usually something there, and you can just boom, tell right away. And you mentioned that a lot of conservatives have this tendency to say, well, yeah, the left just plays on people's emotions. And one of the responses to that you mentioned was when Ben Shapiro said, facts don't care about your feelings. And the only problem with that statement is that it gets the neuroscience exactly backwards. Exactly backwards. That feelings don't care about your facts. Facts can influence feelings, obviously, and feelings come first. So if you're interested in cognitively how our brains are wired, that's how it is. And so I think it's worth embracing both because it just is and because our intuitions are really powerful.
So there is a political tradition in the West that I think would take most of what you're saying and reach the conclusion that therefore what is needful is that we empower those precious few individuals who are, say, the experts who can solve the political problems to get it out of the hands of the mucky multitude that just emote and aren't necessarily in coherence. And this, I don't want to necessarily denigrate them too much, even though, I don't mind Bentham or the Wilsonian model, or, you mentioned an engineer. Obviously, we don't want our engineers just emoting things. We want facts. This was an entire wing of political development or thought or worldview that saw political problems as engineering problems, right? The science of politics. And it seems to fly in the face of how we're wired naturally. But I would go a step further and tell me if you agree or disagree here. I think it also flies in the face of how reality actually works, in that I think it misunderstands the nature of political relationships as some sort of a mathematical formula to be solved. That these are things that any human could ever possess enough knowledge to get the right answer, but B, and maybe even more importantly, that we're even capable of humans as actually answering questions such as what is justice, what is equality, how do you establish a perfect society, in a manner that, for example, could we create a supercomputer AI powered that's so much smarter than all humans that it could actually get the right answer? I would say no, because I think the very nature of the question is such that it's not just a matter of logic. And this is perhaps a clue as to why we humans are wired to emote before reasoning.
Think about what the hyper quote unquote logical expert approach would look like on steroids. I call it well, okay, the best way to wash away somebody's illogical misconceptions is obviously to launch a logic tsunami at them. And that, because that's how people wash away your misconceptions, right? It's like, well, no,
Right.
duh, of course not. And I think so that obviously makes no sense at all. That's super logical. Don't, but and yet we love to launch logic tsunamis, particularly people who fancy themselves as being hyper logical. Never, ever, 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 ever works. So that's part of the problem. And part of the problem is that we can look at the same facts and we can interpret them totally differently. So logic isn't even just one thing. And I think the arrogance that in my previous life as an academic, I encountered a lot of philosophers who thought that in their single brain, they could develop the universal theory of justice. it, it, it only took hundreds of billions of people on this earth, and finally you figured out what justice is. The radical arrogance of that and the complete incoherence of that mindset, like I'm incapable of comprehending those things. They are massive. So it's like, is that really how these things work? No, I don't think so.
Let's turn to the opposite then, because in my view, you can go too far wrong by leaning too much on the feeling aspect of this, right? There is also the milieu in our society of just follow your heart, or the authentic self is somehow all that's necessary. We have again, in my view, a craving for authenticity in our society that is problematic sometimes. Um, Hitler was probably pretty darn authentic. I don't think that made him a great leader necessarily. And maybe in some ways you could say he wasn't. But I think that there is also a real danger in saying, okay, so what the Joshes here are saying is that all that really matters is feelings and logic sort of comes later. I would say, and feel free to, correct the record if you would disagree, that no, feelings are also something that very much, C.S. Lewis, I think the way he said it is the head rules the stomach, and by stomach he meant the feeling. So our logic rules our feelings through the heart. In other words, it's not the logic and it's not the feelings. It's actually the inner man, the spiritual being, the moral compass. And that is something that we can improve upon. It is something we can exercise. It is something we can habituate ourselves. It is something that we can also fall away from and get worse at and harden. And so there is a, I would argue, a third component that stands between the feeling and the fact, which is that capacity for development of morality, understanding, and our moral taste buds, if you will, to try to make sense of this message. Well, here's what I feel. Here's what I think. How do I order these two things rightly?
Totally. It's not feel first and then keep feeling and then only feel and then do what you feel like feeling. That's that's not how persuasion works, and that's not a good way to live either. Essentially, you are trying to figure a way to navigate both your feelings and your reason. So it's not just IQ, but it's also not just the feelings. And I think what brings that together is emotional intelligence. You're trying to fuse these two things together, where it's internally trying to navigate, you know, I don't I don't feel good about this. And okay, well, now I have a problem on my hands, or I feel really great about this. Okay, what do I do? I feel kind of mixed about this. How do I proceed with this? You're trying to navigate those things. And of course, you need logic in the process. And of course, you need to tend to people's emotions, because if somebody's having a bad day or they don't feel good about something, that's going to be a problem for you insofar as you want something from them, because they may not be in a position to give it to them, and you pressing them on that thing could actually really hurt your short, medium, and long term interest. So part of it's just a reality of engaging your and somebody else's feelings, because they're there for a reason and you have to navigate them. So it's a yes and to all of this stuff.
How would you summarize the let's call it the persuasion mindset?
Here's the persuader's mindset. It's simple and not at all easy. I can illustrate it though with a story. The super simple version is that it's about them, not you, which means that you have to put them first, which is really hard. A couple of summers ago, I had a super smart intern, really nice kid, goes to a good school, and he thought that the way to succeed professionally was to come in, talk a lot, wave his hand, say, "Hey, me, look at me. I got all these great ideas, all these great answers." And that's even how he was trained. He was praised for that when he was in high school. And he would interrupt people. He would even interrupt me. At some point, I said, do you think interruption is like the best way to persuade people and to have your voice heard? He was like, ah. And over the course of summer, he evolved in a remarkable way, where he went from making it all about John, was his name, John, to understanding the team and what we needed. And that led to great success with him at the end of the summer. He came in one day, he was like, oh, and guess what happened last night? And I said, what's that? He said, oh, well, I was talking to my girlfriend last night and she's having a problem with her internship. And I just started talking to her and telling her what she should do. And she got really annoyed. And so I stopped that and I listened and I connected to her and I helped her out. The happy reality for John was that because he flipped it and he learned to put them, the team, first instead of making it all about John, his work was exceptional. He was a team player. He always did what we needed. He was the only intern that we kept on and gave a promotion. So it's just that we are wired to think about ourselves. So we adopt a me first mindset. And the problem with that is it's just not persuasive. So the persuader's mindset puts them first. And it's also different from the crusader's mindset, because when I go on a crusade, persuasion is all about conquest. And I don't know, has everyone ever persuaded you through conquest?
Not, not recently.
Probably not ever.
I Yeah, probably not. So I'm wondering if there is a what do we do with the inherent? I'm not going to say it's a contradiction. I don't think it is, but I think there's an inherent tension here. How do I go about persuading someone of something I want if
Yeah.
I'm making it about them?
Yeah. Putting them first is the best way to get what you want. Here's here's why. The first is the missionary reason, which is that putting them first is the right thing to do. That's how we all want to be treated. That's also how you build authentic, trusting relationships. And it is in those authentic, trusting relationships that the best things happen. The mercenary reason is that when you put them first, what do you actually do? You start with listening. And when you're putting them first, understanding their wants and needs, especially through listening and demonstrating understanding of that, so it forms a connection, you're also hearing all the things that they want and all the things that they don't want. In those things that they want, you're looking for overlap between your wants and their wants. And there's invariably going to be overlap, and there's always going to be more than you think. So once they tell you, well, I want these five things, if you're prepared to give them three of those things, if you can get three out of the five things you ask for, somebody feels pretty good. And there might be one or two things that you really want. You can say, look, if I give you those three things, which you already want, so it's like you're making a concession. If I give you those three things, can you give me one of these two things? Those things that you really want. They're like, okay, well, I'm getting three, I'll give him one. And you're at +4. So that overlap is actually where the great things happen. And as you build that trust by agreeing with somebody on things, you're also setting yourself up for medium and long term success because it's a durable deal and it's a durable relationship.
One of the standard, I think, critiques in our current politics towards any sort of idea of compromise, reform, persuasion of the type you're talking about, of course, is that look, you're a useful idiot, right? You're being a little naive. Reality is the other side intends to destroy you in whatever form that takes, maybe not physically, but essentially prevent you from having a voice or any power. And there is no way, it sounds like every effort at trying to put someone else first is just kind of in the back of my mind. Well, if I'm really, really nice to this person, darn it, they're going to be nice to me. And that just seems really naive. So what is the standard critique as to why it may still be worthwhile to pursue this persuasion model, in if to whatever degree that may be the reality that another side truly does not want to compromise?
Dumpster fire. The dumpster fire reality that we live in, everyone knows that it's not working. And everyone knows that there's a better way. And part of that is just you see that by thinking how you would want to be treated and what it would take for you to deal with somebody not once, but repeatedly, and about what your goals are. So everybody knows that if you want to work with somebody time after time, and from the very first time you work with somebody, you want to be eager to implement that deal, not just a deal to sell somebody a product or a political deal where they agree to vote for your policy, a deal at home with your kids or your spouse or whatever. If you want people to implement that deal and then to work with you again, then you have to have a good relationship with them, and it has to be in everybody's interest. And if you want to try to have one-off quote unquote deals with people that they want to drag their feet on and that they're not going to implement because you're going to tell everyone, you're going to brag about how you got the best of them, how you really had them over a barrel, and, ha ha ha. Do you think they're going to work with you again? No, of course not. So, like anybody, I mean, there's a reason why people are fleeing Congress. What is it, like 60 plus people are retiring this year from one of the most prestigious jobs in the world because they know it's a dumpster fire and they don't like it. So, even people inside that institution know it's broken. And the only thing we can do is to adopt a model that we know works and to be champions for that.
If you're comfortable naming names, please do, but that's not necessary. Are there individuals you think that are currently modeling this, showing the capacity to have these kind of, I'm going to call them national, not necessarily an individual running for president, but let's say national figure who has demonstrated the capacity to persuade in a manner that you think would be in keeping with your persuasion mindset?
I'll talk about somebody who used to head a think tank, who is a national figure. I will stay away from mentioning current politicians. Don't want to get myself in too much trouble.
Sure.
I think one of the most persuasive public figures we have is Arthur Brooks.
I knew you were going to say that.
You know it exactly. Yeah. So he is phenomenal. And what makes Arthur Brooks phenomenal? He actually came into being president of the American Enterprise Institute being a little bit more of an ideological warrior, not like on steroids, but a little bit more. Some of his initial books while he was at AEI indicate that. And over his decade there, he evolved into, I think, one of the absolutely most persuasive people in our public space. We can talk about what he did and what made him so persuasive. Short answer, he was a happy warrior. And I think he's great at many levels, and he's continued that. There's a reason why all of his books are bestsellers. He can write a book with Oprah and all these sorts of things. I think he is emblematic of exactly how we need to communicate with people. When he is talking about his conservative advocacy, it comes from his idea of the conservative heart, which I think is great. He talks about loving your enemies. It's like, I mean, you know what everybody needs? We need more enemies. Arr! It's like, and we live at a time where we think that if someone doesn't think just like us all the time, then they're our enemy. They're crazy, stupid, evil, or all of the above. And that's super toxic. So I think Arthur Brooks is a great example, and we would need more people like him in our politics.
Well, and so I guess that's where and I completely understand and respect your natural desire to not throw a name out there, because that could be unfair to one side or the other. I suppose maybe the only way we could do is say, well, here's a Democrat and here's a Republican. But doesn't that just sort of bemoan the very problem we're talking about? We need more people like Arthur Brooks in our politics. Is Arthur Brooks in our politics? Like, to a certain degree, when he was running AEI, I could sort of say, yeah, I think he's sort of seen as national leader. And don't get me wrong, I think the work he's doing is vitally important, but it seems to be far more focused on personal happiness and well-being than it has to do with any policy debates we're having.
That's true, I think, of this current iteration of Arthur Brooks. He's had numerous iterations. Okay, let's talk about political figures. I'll kick over to you for a question. When you think about some of the most persuasive political figures in America over the last 100 years, who comes to mind?
I was going to say Abraham Lincoln, but that's unfair because that's not the last 100 years.
And that's fine. You can have Lincoln, who's great. So, okay, Lincoln.
Yeah, that's stretching back there a bit.
No. Lincoln's good. We'll put him on the table. Who else? Okay.
Well, if I'm trying to be charitable on both sides of the aisle, I would say those who have demonstrated capacity to really persuade the nation would certainly be FDR, Ronald Reagan. Oddly, I think LBJ, maybe he persuaded Congress more than the nation, but he may be an outlier there. But Reagan, FDR, if I'm talking non-politics, I suppose Martin Luther King. And it is interesting because I think all three of these individuals, at least King and Reagan, I think it's odd that a lot of the persuasions almost came after they were out of power or after they had died, more so than when they were in it. But nonetheless, I think maybe those four, Lincoln, FDR, Ronald Reagan, and Martin Luther King Jr., I suppose would be the big four I'm thinking of.
Those are fantastic examples. Would I offend you if I added JFK to that list?
Offend? Absolutely not. I think he's slightly more of a lightweight than those four, but I understand why a lot of people see him as a very persuasive person.
He didn't have as long, so his time was cut short. Okay, so intuitively, you gave the same answer that those are the names that always pop up. Why? Well, this is how you persuade people. You don't persuade them by bombarding them with negativity. You persuade people through positive feelings. And the best way to generate positive feelings is to be for something. Let's look at all of these folks. Abraham Lincoln, he was for not just the Union, he was for the Declaration and the Constitution. He talked about the Declaration as the frame around this beautiful thing that was the Declaration. He was for all of those things. Just imagine if instead of saying with malice toward none, is it toward or for none? I think it's toward. With malice toward none, he had said, with malice for all my enemies. No, oh my God, that would have been totally different. It would have made for an even more brutal civil war. FDR said the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself. Imagine if he had said, well, things going to hell in a handbasket. Hang on tight, everybody, because this is terrible. And you're fearful now. Things are only going to get worse. So sorry. That's not such a good message. It may have been helpful for him politically to blame his predecessor. He didn't say that. He didn't do that. Look at JFK. He said, ask not. And he talked about a moonshot. Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream. Ronald Reagan saw America as a shining city. If you look at those last three examples, nobody ever says Walter Mondale. They always say JFK. Nobody ever says Malcolm X. They always say Martin Luther King Jr. Nobody ever says Barry Goldwater. They always say Ronald Reagan. Our intuitions always go to the same people. They always go to the right place. Mine go to Arthur Brooks in part because he's a happy warrior. Yes, he's not a politician. He's probably much happier for it. And look at our politicians. All these politicians, they were for things and they were ultimately happy warriors. And they're the ones who built durable movements. And that's one of the questions I would ask politicians. Do you actually want to build a durable movement that does good things for the country? If you want to do that, you have to be for things and you have to be ultimately a positive, happy warrior.
How much of that do you believe is a quirk of the American experience, culture, history? I mean, I've heard often that we have the happy accident of having been so successful over the past several centuries in comparison to almost any other nation state that has had to necessarily be a little bit more circumspect and humble about their circumstances and their ability to achieve. Is that something that is universally human? Well, let me rephrase. Obviously, it's universally human, but is it something that is amplified in our own culture as Americans? Because oftentimes, these people you're talking about, FDR or Ronald Reagan, certainly Lincoln, they anchored what they were saying to the fact it was freaking America. They weren't necessarily saying all humans. They were saying, of course, Reagan, of course we can do it. We're Americans. Lincoln was very clear that this was an American prospect. I can't think of exact specifics under FDR. I'm sure they were there. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. was all about, cashing the promissory note that had been written as an American. Are you trading off something that works within our culture better than elsewhere, or is that irrelevant?
We are all wired, all 8 billion of us, in the ways that I've talked about. And I think that there's something special about America that makes it even easier to do these things. America is different from every other nation on earth. America is founded on an idea. It is not founded on race or creed or blood or whatever. It's founded on an idea. And those ideas are all four things. Some of the most iconic words in the history of mankind were penned by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, goodness, what better thing to be for? there aren't many I can think of than the pursuit of happiness. It's an amazing, beautiful thing. And we have institutions that are built for protecting our rights, but ultimately for our ability to pursue happiness. And America has the moniker land of opportunity. So we are a nation that is for opportunity. And these things are at the heart of what we call the American dream. And that dream is something that appeals not simply to people in this country or maybe in this hemisphere. It is something that somehow has pretty much universal appeal insofar as hundreds of millions, I don't know, billions of people have moved here to pursue that dream. And if we didn't have borders, tomorrow we'd have 1 billion people enter this country to pursue their version of the American dream. There is something special about America, and it's kind of some of these core human things on steroids.
And I understand a lot of your argument is that the persuasion mindset is both innate in humans and yet also runs against the grains of our nature. For example, to put other people first, or to realize we feel before we think. I'm curious about that third aspect. We are wired for negativity, and I've had many guests on before. There's all sorts of evolutionary answers, psychological answers, all sorts of some of them just makes a lot of sense. You understand why humans survived if their first instinct is to assume something's going to kill you instead of this may be my friend. You might live a bit longer and able to produce some offspring and survive as a species. It's also something that naturally we can overcome. And we were talking earlier about sort of I don't want to say it's necessarily the opposite, but it certainly runs against it, the kind of optimism of the American experiment. Okay, so we mentioned those big four: Lincoln, and you may have better ones to throw in there. I guess I'll I'll shoe JFK in there as a fifth one, I suppose. But if we bring it up to as close today as possible, Ronald Reagan, someone who had served in our lifetime, anyways. If we run from, let's say, post Reagan till today, the two names that stick out in my mind as sort of linchpins of, I am honestly amazed the degree to which Bill Clinton's presidency was less impactful in the future than I thought it would. Like when I was growing up, that was everything. Clinton had oversized everything, and we hardly ever talk about the '90s era and how it shapes modern politics. And I'll also put a pin in let's say George Bush and Joe Biden. Let's look at the other two figures, Barack Obama and Donald Trump. Now, to Trump, I think is kind of what I'm about to say on steroids about Obama, which is neither of these two individuals, in my view, echo any of the sort of persuasion tactic that you would describe as sort of the being for something. Now, in complete fairness, you can look at certain aspects of both of these presidents, Obama and Trump, and clearly say, yes, they are for something. They do have a positive message. They clearly have a message that resonates with a certain base. I mean, Trump has ascended to sort of a cult-like figure, but honestly, in the early days of Obama's presidency, he was a cult-like figure, a messianic figure almost. And, the yes, we can, change you can believe in, hope and change, sort of we have achieved just the mere fact we could put a black man in the White House, I'll be happily admit that's an achievement. And then certainly Donald Trump with his America First, Make America Great Again. I think there were some aspects in which he borrows some of that from Ronald Reagan, but I think you can see some of that sitting on a hill there too, even though I would argue it's a very different meaning. So I guess where I'm going with this is I would also strongly argue that neither of these two individuals in any way represent the sort of persuasion you're saying, even though it seems to be kind of a mixed bag. It seems to be almost I'm going to sell the positive message for those who are already inclined to agree with me, while deliberately doing things to draw bright red lines and saying, but everybody else is against us and essentially not worth our time persuading. Is that a fair summation? Is that what we're seeing these days, that both the left and the right, broadly speaking, in these sort of two models, is that the only persuading you do is on your side?
Words and actions have to align. Let's talk about the three folks that you mentioned: Bill Clinton, Barack Obama. I'll talk about candidate Trump. I'll stop in 2016 in there, if you'll allow me that. Okay. I do think that Bill Clinton, his superpower was an ability to make, and this has been verified by like tons of people, make you feel like when he was talking to you that you were the only person in the world. And his ability to connect and empathize, superpower. That's what propelled him to the presidency. While in 1992, he's in a town hall walking over to people and connecting with them. George H.W. Bush is looking at his watch.
Looking at his wristwatch.
Exactly. It's like, oh, hey, man, are we done here yet? And Bill Clinton, he meant it, because you cannot fool all the people that say this if he was inauthentic. And we could talk about why his presidency was not as effective as it could have been. There was welfare reform. That was great. And he kind of was president at a weird time. USSR had just fallen. So, okay, fine. That at least that's the start. His emotional intelligence is totally just off the charts. So that's a good place to start. Barack Obama started with some really powerful things. But so what did he start with? Well, his 2004 speech to the Democrat National Convention is an absolute masterpiece. Particularly, he has 2 or 3 minutes in that speech that if they don't give you goosebumps, it's like you need to listen to that again, because they are absolutely remarkable. And then what did he get right in his campaign? Positive hope and change. The same thing with his Democrat National Convention speech. He was for one United States, e pluribus unum, out of many one. That's a beautiful thing. And in that speech, he even makes powerful appeals, not just to folks on the left, but to conservatives as well. I think that while the words were good, the actions were not of somebody who truly wanted to be for things and to unify e pluribus unum. I recall, I forget the year, but he invited Paul Ryan, and I think it was John Boehner, to a press conference about something, and then use that as an opportunity to just lash out at them. And they were on the front row. It's like, oh, is that really Is that really a way to overcome partisanship? No, that's a way to call out invite your enemies, and then on public national television, tell them how crazy, stupid, and evil they are. So actions have to correspond with words. And I think for Obama, they so obviously didn't. Uh, when did he truly and authentically want the things that he wanted with folks on the other side? He, I think, has increasingly gotten happy to malign the other side's intentions, and that's just no good. What did candidate Trump do that helped propel him to the presidency? I think two things. I think that a lot of other candidates were Republican candidates in 2016 were overlooking the the distressing lived experiences of many Americans, especially say folks in the Rust Belt who they had felt like they had been hurt by globalization and losing factories and things like that. And candidate Trump said something that was so insanely powerful. He said, "I will be your voice." And for somebody who felt voiceless and felt like the system was not speaking for them and was not even listening to them, that was so powerful. And I think that that's one of the things that conservatives need to be more mindful of is that, look, I mean, I love capitalism and I love markets, and it has not been universally good for everybody. And I think that Trump tapped into that. And then he was still for something. You already alluded to it, taken from Ronald Reagan to make America great again. So those hats are for something, making America great again. So well, fine, we can take it, but that's a powerful thing. So it starts there, and then you might ask the same thing: words, actions, words, actions.
So let me follow up with that, because one of my chief complaints when Obama was running for president is that change you can believe in and hope and change to me sound like fill in the blank here, happy-go-lucky slogans. They're very positive and they're very much for something. I don't know what that something is necessarily. I think, and it was always my concern is what Obama supporter A thought that something was invariably going to be slightly different than what Obama supporter B thought. I had the exact same complaint about Make America Great Again. When was it great? What do we mean by that? Whose vision are we following here exactly? And granted, I know, it's just who I am. I've always been against campaign slogans you can slap on the back of a bumper sticker. It rarely gets enough of the information across for me to get on board with it. I think my favorite one I ever saw was a bumper sticker that literally read, "Vote for Jesus or go to hell." And I have no idea what that was advocating, but it meant it very passionately, evidently.
Yeah.
When I juxtapose that with City on the Hill, we think of a Ronald Reagan. Yes, that's something you could slap on the back of a bumper sticker, but that was something he said after almost 8 years as president, and he said it at sort of the height of his, I think it was, if I remember correctly, his farewell address.
That was, yes.
And
That's
he
right.
elucidated it, sort of saying, putting these pieces together, I've always tried to summarize what I mean by the City on the Hill, and here's what I think. And so, in other words, it was something that, and in all fairness, Obama and Trump do this too. They weave these slogans in with their speeches and try to build off of them. But I think, to me, Reagan was someone who demonstrated this. He put flesh on the bones, right? He showed us what this meant over a long period of time, and maybe this is what you mean by words in action. That he demonstrated this, he elucidated it in a manner that is deep and complex, and we can argue, maybe you're for it or against it. I'm not trying to say everybody listening to this was for Ronald Reagan, but it's at least something you could tangle with in a manner that I think it would be harder to say that of Obama and certainly of Trump. And so again, I don't know that there's a question there, but is that maybe just another way of saying you have to follow words with action, or is there more to that?
There's more to it, and you used an extremely powerful word in my book. I have a whole chapter about this. Vision. Vision, vision, vision. It's extremely important. Let's focus on Reagan. Again, I don't want to comment on people who are currently in office. So I will focus on Reagan. And why is vision so important? Well, vision animates action. And vision is your North Star. And it is that thing that gets you up in the morning and that gets others to follow you. Leaders have to have visions. I mean, what would it mean to be a leader of an organization or of a country or a state or a community or even of a family or even of your own life without a vision? Because if you don't know where you're going, it's going to be hard to get there. And if you don't know where you want to go, if you're leading others, then, it's more people who don't know where they're going. Vision animates action. And Ronald Reagan had a vision, and he did, kind of funny enough, articulate it after those 8 years. He kind of, in summary, and okay. And his farewell address is just an absolute masterpiece. And not just because the words sounded good, because it articulated a vision for what America is at its best. And that is powerful. And I think that any politician who wants to enact lasting change and to form a movement and to have people look back and say, yeah, like we still believe in this. There's a reason why there are still so many Reagan conservatives, because he articulated a powerful vision that they can go back to and watch just those couple of minutes near the end of his farewell address. That it's like, it just gives you goosebumps when you read it. If that's a vision that resonates with you, it's really powerful. I think when you talk about Obama, I don't know that that vision was ever articulated. And I think that probably got him into trouble, because hope and change is positive and sounds good. It's also effusive, and it can kind of mean anything to everybody. And without enough meat on the bones, then once the rubber hits the road and you go from candidate to elected official, if you haven't put any meat on the bones and you start to put some of your meat on the bones, people are like, well, wait a minute, that's not what I thought I was buying. And I think that Reagan was always clear from it was at 64 when he gave the a time for choosing speech, right? Like, you didn't really,
For
I mean,
Goldwater, yeah.
exactly. It was, I mean, from 64 to 80 to 88, it was consistent. The principles were consistent and the ideas were consistent, and a lot of his policies followed those things. Again, you don't have to agree with everything that Reagan did and whatever. Like, there was consistency throughout that. Time for choosing, that vision, you can tie that directly to the farewell address. They are consistent. And that drove him, and that gave people clarity on what Ronald Reagan stood for, so that when he did things, it wasn't jarring, but rather, yeah, that's great. We like that. We support that. And that aligns with what we expected. And that aligns with the vision that we share together, meaning individual and Ronald Reagan.
How do we juxtapose your advocacy here for these principles of persuasion with what, in my view, is another problem that's very common with our politicians today, and that's the sort of temptation to overpromise things, right? You've got whether that's Mondami of, we're going to usher in the socialist utopia, or Trump of we're making America great again. Like, to whatever degree you could say, because I could see a version of this where a politician does communicate effectively a positive vision in a persuasive manner, but is utterly detached from what the power of the office they seek even has the capacity to do.
There are a couple of things there. The first is trust. If you overpromise in a wild way and you can't deliver because those are overpromises, then people aren't going to trust you. So it is not in your long-term interest to overpromise in ways that you simply can never achieve. Because then 4 years later, when you run again for office, 2, 4, 6, whatever it is, and you haven't achieved anything, people are going to be like, well, wait a minute. You said you would, your opponent's going to say, wait a minute. You said you were going to do all these things and you didn't do any of them. That destroys your credibility. And that even destroys credibility, not just the people who vote for you, that destroys credibility of people who might want to work with you, whether they're other elected officials or just other influential stakeholders. You need trust to actually get things done. When you overpromise, that's not going to be helpful. I think that's one crucial component, trust. And then you also have to be able to understand and navigate reality. And I think some politicians get themselves in trouble because they have great ideas, and then they just either don't know how to or have no interest in navigating political realities, and they can't see things clearly. And they maybe think that, well, say like a businessman who comes into politics, like, isn't it so simple? Well, I mean, maybe in a sense for you, this is a different environment. So this isn't business, it's politics. And that gets people in trouble. Or when people come into politics and they think, oh, well, I'm right and everyone else is wrong. And they may have had that positive vision, but then they don't know how to actually implement it because rubber hits road, and they kind of have a wreck.
Do you think we are ripe for I'm going to call it a statesman, because the attributes you listed just there at the end of kind of circumspect and clear-eyed about what is possible, coupled with a positive vision, I think all that kind of can wrap within a statesmanship type address, which is something that it's such a rare creature. You hardly ever see one running around these days. Lincoln, in my view, is the ultimate American statesman. But you don't get a lot of Abraham Lincolns, maybe once in a lifetime, if that. I also have long been of the belief that that doesn't mean because these things are just rare creatures that don't exist. It means that sometimes the populace needs to be willing to elect one. It was Milton Friedman who'd said of Ronald Reagan, you had alluded to this earlier, he gives his time for choosing speech in 1964 to help Barry Goldwater. He doesn't become president until 1980, but 1964, and then again in 1970 when he runs for president, and then ultimately 1980, Milton Friedman said Ronald Reagan was the only president, he was unique in my lifetime, and that he was the only president who had not said what everyone wanted to hear, but that eventually people began to hear what he had been saying for 2 decades. And it was the same message. Now, in all fairness, he was the great communicator. He found a way to connect with, your advice about giving stories, I think he's probably example number one of the person who would give personal stories. He was a very effective communicator, and he honed that skill. But I guess I'm asking, is there a sense in which we, the people, need to be ready to hone our own skills as to how to look for this leader that has a capacity for statesmanship?
I'm hopeful that some things could align that would make that possible. I think there are a couple of things that would need to shift. And I'm optimistic because, well, remember the dumpster fire. Everybody knows that something's not right. And the just like with other programs, the first step is admitting that you have a problem. And when only 2% of Americans have a positive word to say about American politics, and 79% have a negative word, and one of the most popular ones is dumpster fire, we're admitting that we have a problem. And you cannot solve things unless you admit that you have a problem. It's like, remember the last time you went to a friend, you're like, or a colleague or a family member, it's like, you need to change. And it's like, no, I don't. Why would I? No, things are bad. No, things are great. You're getting nowhere. There is 79% is as universal as you're going to get in a poll. Because remember, it's only 2% who saw positive. That's about as universal as you're going to get, where people universally say our politics are broken and we do not like this. We do not like how things are. I think that's the start. And I think even people are starting to understand what social media does to us. And I think there's a movement of people stepping back from social media and not wanting to just stew in all the radical negativity. That's positive in my mind. Okay, what else do we need? We need some adults in the room, people who are willing to lead and to have the courage to try that. And I'm sure there are people out there. If we think about, well, we mentioned Arthur Brooks. Imagine a politician like Arthur Brooks who might want to step into the space, and then there will be support for that, because in the same way that only 2% of Americans are positive and 79% are negative, that means that I think there are a lot of people who are ready to support something that looks very different, that looks better and more positive. And the stars, I think, could align, particularly just based on how toxic things have gotten, that no, like we need something else. I am hopeful. There's no guarantee. And I think one thing that has to happen is that we live in a populist moment, and that can take us in a more populist direction, or it could also take us in an empathic direction and say, look, these are real concerns that people have. And here, so yes, acknowledge that. And here is how my vision, here is how my policies can address them. Instead of just dismissing those concerns, align your values and your vision with their concerns. That requires a lot of emotional intelligence. And that's something that people like Ronald Reagan had, that Abraham Lincoln had, in an absolute abundance.
The name of the book, How to Get What You Want, Mastering the Art and Science of Persuasion by Joshua Bandoch. Is there anywhere else we should send? I know you can get that book on Amazon, wherever fine books are sold, but is there anywhere else we should send the listener to if they're interested in more of your work?
So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, the Simon Schuster website, you can find the book there. If you want to get a snippet of some of the things we talked about only briefly, but the psychology and neuroscience, I give a TED Talk, a TEDx talk, so people can find that. You can also just go to my website, joshuabandoch.com, and learn more about me. If I can leave the audience with a closing statement, perhaps we should have said this up front. I do think that one of the questions that you have to ask yourself in every single interaction, personal and professional, is a simple one, and that's a really hard one. Do I want to be right, or do I want to make a difference? And I think that our politics today is focused on being right and nothing's getting done. And if you want to make a difference, it's a different enterprise. It's a long-term enterprise. It's a durable enterprise. It's a much more successful enterprise. And that's what persuasion is.
Definitely something to chew on. Thanks, Josh. And thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
It's a pleasure. Josh, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.